everybody. I'm Tejas. I'm currently working with Sumo Digital. So before I begin with my talk, let me just show you a little bit of who we are. There we go. Right. So Sumo Digital was founded in 2003. They generally make games across multiple platforms, and they have studios all over the world, of which Pune is a part. They've made over 60 games over the last, 17 years now? No, 16 years. This is some of them. There's a few more that are in progress that hopefully at some point in the future we get to talk about and show you. But yeah, this is what Sumo is. Now, I'm going to get back to what we'll actually talk about. So the name of this presentation is Designing Under Duress. A lot of you who work on mobile, live ops, or even PC and console, quite often you don't have the luxury of time that you wish you could have. More often than not, you have to deliver something yesterday that you had to do today. And you'll have pressure from all over the place. And the question is, how do you deal with that? So to that end, we're going to be talking about two things. First is how to understand and set your priorities, and how to plan, and how this wraps back into design. First of all, what you need to know about like short-term projects is that if you are an experience-based designer, someone who's used to iteration, who's used to like finding the fun because you have an idea of what you want, but not a concrete vision, you're pretty much screwed. This is not a type of development style that's meant for you. This is grueling, and it's difficult, and you will not have the time that you need to get something to be as perfect as you'd like. This means you need discipline. You cannot, waver with your emotions. You cannot make a decision and then go back on it later on. And it's not easy. It's really hard to stay focused on one thing, even when you know it's not going to be perfect. So that's why it's all about making hard decisions. And at the end of the day, whether they're good, bad, you're going to have to live with it. It's the other side of game design that not everyone likes to talk about, is the accountability of the decisions you make. So before I begin, just so you know who I am and what I've done and why I'm talking about this specifically, this is what I have done. I worked with an indie game company called Blue Giant that made an RTS in a year. We were initially given 6 months. I worked at YesNo. I worked at Glue, also known as Kryptonite Games in Hyderabad. Here, it was a lot of live op titles, and even those, you're now racing against the clock. There are a lot of people who are already playing a game, and you need features to go out at a regular clip. So again, limited time. Then I worked as an indie for a while, and again, indie, you have a time crunch. You have to get things done before you run out of money, you run out of patience, you run out of passion, whatever, what have you. And finally, I am now currently with Sumo Digital. So despite the fact that I've done this quite a few times, it's almost become a recurring theme in my career, I haven't learned it all. I've still made mistakes. A lot of what I'm going to tell you about is because I made mistakes, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to be making more going down this career. But let's get into it. Let's talk about setting priorities. We're going to hit 4 topics, yeah? First is figuring out what your game is, then figuring out what your game must achieve at all costs. This was covered a little bit in the last talk. Figuring out what your team is capable and who you're building for. So when you know who you're building for, you have priorities. You know, it gives you clarity. It gives you a sense of knowing that, okay, this is who I want to build for, this is why, and this is what's going to happen. That clarity is extremely important when you have to start making decisions. So first, you want to start understanding your game. So obviously, you want to understand your genre. What are you making? What has your team decided to make? Let's say you're making a platformer, then fine. You've chosen a genre. Now, what makes platformers platformers? Look at your competition. Figure out what they do well. List those features down as, okay, these are absolute DNA items for this genre. I need to be able to jump. I need verticality. I need so on and so forth. Fine, that's part of your DNA. And they could even be small things that when I get off of a jump, I want to see a little VFX burst that says that I did, in fact, jump. However, you can't do it all. You cannot take all those features and innovate everywhere because you don't have time. If you had time, well, then I wouldn't be giving this talk. You choose an area to innovate in. Find from that list of items that you've created the one thing that really matters to you and your team and go ham on it. Make it amazing. Like I said here, dive deep. Figure out what that one mechanic is, what you can do with that mechanic that makes it really pop. But the one thing. So we've essentially talked about two things already. So let's talk about teams. If you're working indie or if you're working in a larger company, a lot of things will change depending on who you're with. So you want to understand your team's skill set. Does this programmer excel at gameplay programming or networking or something else? Does this artist do really good VFX art or sprite sheets, or is it maybe 3D that he focuses on? What are your design capabilities, right? Are you someone who can really design well-built systems, or are you more of an experiential person, in which case maybe you want to lean into that? Because that is going to help you decide where you can actually get output that matters to your game. Committing to something that you or your team do not have a skill set for or a passion for is not going to work out in the long run. Because when you have a time crunch, you have to realize everyone's going to get really frustrated really fast. And part of your job as a designer, especially as being someone who goes between art and tech, and to some end production and QA as well, you want to be there to kind of keep everyone calm, keep everyone focused. You are the vision holder in a way for your feature or for your game. So it's a bit like the Laugh Olympics. You're all a crazy bunch of people with different skills. Okay, how old is everyone here? Does anyone even remember this? 1, 2, okay, a few, good. I was worried about another okay boomer moment. Yeah, so it's like this. It's like the Laugh Olympics. You're just a bunch of crazy people with very different skill sets trying to make something work. Now this is the big one, your audience. There are a lot of different ways you can get data for who your audience is. There's Quantic Foundry, there are different setups that you can use really. Personally, I like Quantic Foundry because it's kind of very well set up. And this is gonna allow you to, again, figure out, okay, I'm making it for this kind of person. In mobile, they have, I forgot the term, but it's basically user stories, I believe, where you define who your player is, what age they are, what they like. On a larger term, especially for design, what you do want to focus on is what their motivations are. What do they want, right? Now again, there's a lot of stuff to choose from. You cannot do it all. Choose one thing, choose 2 things at most, and then subdivide. Fine, I want someone who's a social player, but again, in social, are they competitive or community driven? Those are 2 completely different types of design sets. Choose one of those. Yeah, I probably should have moved sooner. But when you have your audience figured out, you're going to understand what they value, right? You know your genre, you know your audience. You will now know what this audience member is willing to forgive and is not willing to forgive. Take an example of RPGs. A lot of RPG games can get away with shitty graphics if they're AA or lower. If they're not, then maybe they can get away with something else. So again, time crunch, figure out what you can get away with so you can focus on the things that matter. From a data standpoint, especially again, because a lot of you might be working on mobile, KPIs really help out in this matter because you have live data coming at you all the time. You can see how users are behaving. However, know that KPIs tell you behavior. They do not tell you intent. There's a difference between behavior and intent. So diving into intent is something that requires a bit of a softer touch, something that a designer has to then parse through. So do not always go with data 100%. Either that way lies madness, and that's the other extreme end of a spectrum, where the other extreme is just feelings. If, let's say, you don't have a live game, things you can do are, well, you have focus tests and all that. Larger companies do that. But if you're smaller, do internal tests, right? But don't just do a test and have somebody play it and watch them. Figure out questions you want to ask them. Figure out a process for yourself that says, look, I want them to play this and I want this kind of data as a result, so that you structure your questions according to the data you want, right? I can give you a bit of an example of this, maybe after the talk if we have time, or if you find me somewhere outside, go ahead. Finally, you've got a lot of lists that I've just talked about, making 4 different sets of lists. Don't bloat that, right? Keep it manageable, keep it something that you can understand, because at the end of the day, this is something you're gonna give to the rest of the team, and as a designer, you are gonna reinforce this constantly. You're a little political officer running around your office telling everyone that every decision they're made has to go through this list of questions to see if it actually is feasible, if it matters for the game, if it's worthwhile. We've talked about priorities, you know? Now we can get to the other half of it, which is also not design heavy, a little more production heavy, but it's planning. So when we plan, like we said earlier, you want to deliver one good thing. You want to work backwards after you figured out what you do want to deliver as a whole. You want to always be cognizant that there are knock-on effects. Something you do yourself is going to affect every other team, even if you think it's a small change. Even a variable change is going to mean extra work for somebody somewhere, even if you think it's not going to be that case. Finally, you never have enough time. Even if you know that I have 1 year to get this done or 2 months to get this done, it's always going to feel like less. So let's talk about the first one thing. So you've already decided, because of your priorities, that I want to focus on this aspect of the game. I want to make this feel perfect. So you want to start iterating on that. That means you want to plan into your timeline that first, and then start iterating on that and plan those iterations. Again, be definitive. Do not just be like, oh yeah, we'll keep playing with it. No, set goals for that. We'll be talking about that in a bit as well. But for each iteration, if you do not have a defined goal, you will basically end up just kind of going through the woods with no clear direction. If you set up a goal that, okay, at the end of this milestone, I want this feature that's, let's say, movement-based to feel really good. I want it to feel responsive. Then responsiveness is a metric you can track. It's something that you can quantify and then test for. And then if you've achieved that, you can move to a next iteration. If not, then you're like, okay, we're stuck in this iteration. We have to continue with it. Working backwards. Now, we've all seen this fun little doodle all over the place where you can either work good, fast, cheap, generally a mixture of two, and there's no perfect scenario where you have it all. In reality, it's kind of like this, you know, because even when you mix shit, you're not going to get something that's great. You're going to get stuff that's ugly, you know, or it's just going to be delayed indefinitely, and it's not going to get you anywhere. But again, this is not always 100% accurate for our timeline either. You're looking at fidelity versus product. You're looking at polish, iteration, and content versus the stability of the game. And yes, you do want your game to look good. Who doesn't? You want to iterate so you can get the best version of the game that you're passionate about making. And you do want enough content so that you can sell it at a price that matters and not have players complain that, oh, I got into the game and I had nothing to do. Again, we can still refine this because at the end of the day, you can release something that's a little ugly but at least doesn't crash and is completely playable on whatever platforms you've chosen. That is more meaningful than having a really pretty piece of shit that constantly crashes. Because again, at the end of the day, whether we like saying it or not, we are selling a product and people will play and buy this product. And if they are crashing, if they're being thrown out of the game, it doesn't matter. So always make sure you budget time for these things. You know, do you have enough time for a full playable? Do you have enough time to make sure that you pass certification for whatever platform you're on? Is it stable? And is it still stable? Because you will always get bugs that are weird and will frustrate everybody, and nobody knows where they came from, right? So this is why you plan backwards. You figure out that I have an year, and you budget, let's say 30% of that time to say, this is QA, where nothing changes in the game. We only fix things, no matter how bad you want to fix things. And that's where discipline comes in. You plan out each sprint, you set those goals, and I know it sounds like shit, but planning is essential because you do not want a situation when you don't have time where someone comes up to you and says, so what do I do today? Well, shit. That's not, then you have to figure out something. You'll throw something at him real quick because it was on the top of your head, but it may not be what you needed. It may not be what the game required. I mentioned this before, knock-on effects. And this is from personal experience. I can change a variable because I was like, oh yeah, this makes the character feel just a little bit snappier, a little bit better. That also means QA now has to do a full pass on that character, and again, most likely in multiple levels to make sure that it's absolutely okay. So me changing a 0.5 to a 0.65 meant QA had to spend an extra 3 hours working and verifying that what I did is valid and works across the game and doesn't break shit. And that's 3 hours they could have spent on stuff that they already had planned. And this shit will constantly domino effect forward. Also, no matter how much you've worked on something, no matter how confident you are that, oh, I've been doing this for 6 months or 2 months, or I built this, do not underestimate human error. That, especially towards the end of a project. You could be at the end, you could be, just a little rushed, it could be a bad day, who knows? There are variables all over our lives. Something will go wrong, something will go wrong because Murphy's Law, and that doesn't fail. So what can you do? First, you want to be clear, right? I know I'm repeating myself, but that clarity, that discipline is the crux of this talk, is you need to know what you want to be doing at every point of this journey. That isn't to say everything's set in stone and you cannot pivot, but understand when to pivot and communicate that to other people. Because if your team is not aware of something, they're going to chug ahead while you're doing something else. And it's just going to end up a train wreck at the end of it. This is also why, especially with larger teams, you want to lead sync, right? Get all the leads in, make sure everyone's on the same page about what exactly is happening. And then they can communicate that to their teams. If it's a smaller team, just talk to each other regularly and be like, okay, guys, what are we going to do this week? What do we want to show each other by Friday? Because that's really going to help you achieve those goals that you need to. We're on our last point, guys. We're almost there. Don't panic. For anyone who likes sci-fi, that's familiar, because you don't have time, and it's so easy to panic. It is infinitely easy to panic. For a lot of you who've worked in studios, you've seen other people panic, but you also know that when they panic, you panic, and the team panics. And even if you try and hold it in, that panic, that behavior is going to seep through your actions in unconscious ways, and people will know and will affect them, and it will affect the way they work. So you got to stay cool. You got to let people know that it's cool. It's probably a good part for a Pulp Fiction GIF. I missed that opportunity. But everybody needs to stay cool, and you can finally get somewhere. So again, 30% of your time, that's for fixing. You want to make that sacrosanct. You do not want that to shift, because that's a very slippery slope. And I've been on that slope, and it leads to delays, and it leads to a lot of people being frustrated. And again, larger studios, it leads to attrition. So this is the hard part, the second one. You got to learn to live with your decisions. You made a bad call. Sure, you screwed up. Move on. It's in the game, it's there. Talk to your team if there's a way you guys can work together to fix it. Make sure everybody is bought into this decision, especially QA. If it's not something that can be fixed, remember that so that you don't do it again next time. But don't dwell on it, because again, that way lies madness, therein is the abyss. Finally, there are limitations to this production cycle. When you don't have time, that means you're saying, there are a set of things we will never be able to accomplish. So don't even expect them. And make that very clear to everybody involved. If someone's pushing you, let them know that, okay, this is what you've asked for. This is what I can do. Your timeline means these other things will not be done, so do not expect them. Those expectations are super important, again, for a higher project where you have someone who's going to try and hold you accountable. So you want to, shoot out those mails and have your, your checks in place. And if you're a smaller team, it's something you guys need to really talk about and figure out and be like, okay, guys, this is not something we can really commit to. It's just not what's possible for us. And that's okay. That's a big thing, especially when you're indie, you think you want to do it all, but you can't. And that's okay. It's not a big deal. It's a game. That's why you find one thing that you can really focus on. So that's what you're proud of and not something else that maybe won't matter. Because at the end of the day, the really good thing is what people will remember. So that's how you can think about planning. Finally, this is something that's been I've been thinking about for a while, and sometime down the line I'm going to try and implement this, is to make sure that teams playtest at the end of the sprint. I've been to a few different studios. Some places do this, some places don't. It's kind of a mix, but I've really found that this is important. And it's not about, hey, let's get everyone together and force them to play the game. No, get like a meeting room or just collect in an area, chill out, get some snacks and all. Get someone to play the game, all of you can watch, or if it works better for you, everyone can play the game and then you talk about it later. But remember, you have to be focused. So when you define what your goals for a sprint are, that's what you're testing for. That's what you tell your team that, okay, guys, we built this feature. And sure, there's a lot of stuff in the game that we want to fix. Let's talk about what we built in this sprint first. Then we'll talk about the other stuff. You make a list of things you want to fix in that feature, and you spend a week fixing those things. So there's no last-minute fixes. You've budgeted time to make those fixes. And if you have extra, all those generic fixes that you have planned, those also come in. And it's generally a win-win for everyone. This is basically the layout of the same thing. You want to define your goals at the beginning of a sprint. This is general agile stuff. It's not rocket science. You want to execute your plan, and again, you communicate. If something really breaks halfway through, you pivot. You make sure you're not just stuck doing the same thing and breaking it for another week and a half. Make sure that last day is a day that you're just letting the team relax after a sprint. Play the game, figure things out together, talk, kind of get everyone back on the same page, and then you have your 1 week buffer. That's it, more or less. So this is what we've talked about today, is understanding and setting priorities. So to that end, define your game, your goals, and your audience, and be very clear on what these are and what you want to achieve and what you cannot achieve and what is okay not to achieve. And then you plan accordingly. You plan to iterate, you budget for stability, and please, if there's no other takeaway, please, for God's sake, budget for stability. Because the number of times, and I know a lot of you know this, you've been there, you're spending, 18-hour days just to fix something because changes came in last minute. This is how you can stop that. And finally, plan backwards. So that's my talk. Would you please check the QR code? You give feedback. It's really helpful for the organizers. And for me, I know whether this talk was actually effective. They know whether they should bring me back. Well, everybody, if you've already taken the QR code, if you want to get in touch with me, this is where you can find me, open to answering questions at any point. I know this was more of a production talk, less designy, but as a designer, I've realized how important this is.